we're talking more from a cardholder perspective, which I thought was very interesting, where, looking at the marketplace, there is no marketplace on the acquiring side. And I think that because we really live on the acquiring side, it's interesting to me that regardless of what innovation occurs for the users, the marketing or the acquiring side just gets stuck because we're just stuck.
Yeah, I have a different take. I mean, I know exactly where you're coming from on that. I have a different take. So,
No.
but I think acquiring is vigorously competitive, and I would argue and have argued that over the last 2 decades, there's been far more innovation on the acquiring side than the issuing side. But I think a lot of the discomfort from the acquirers and the merchant lobby comes from the fact that in some respects, they are price takers in the system, the asymmetric pricing. So, and that's just a core thing that the asymmetric nature of interchange pricing is, I think, fundamentally what torques people on the acceptance side of the network. Acquirers as well, because acquirers, setting aside debit routing, have been price takers from the network standpoint. So if a large network wants to raise its licensing fees on the acceptance side of the network, usually there's not a lot of discussion about that, right? And if interchange goes up and down, but it flows mostly from the merchant to the issuer and then some of it onto the cardholder. Oh, I say mostly. So for ATMs, it doesn't work that way. ATMs, interchange flows to the owner of the ATM, which is often a merchant, because otherwise no one would deploy merchants. And I would add, and I love to do this because it illustrates some of the dynamics, interchange in retail payment systems has occasionally, very occasionally, been paid to merchants. And it has been paid to merchants where merchants could control and shift share. So there still is the national debit network in Australia. So the 3 debit networks in Australia, Visa, MasterCard, and the national debit network. And for many, many years, interchange for the national debit network was paid by issuers, the banks, large banks, to merchants. Merchants said, we're not going to accept it unless you pay us. This had nothing to do with cost. So merchants said we're going to have all this cost to support it. As issuers, when issuers defend interchange in the United States and elsewhere, and they say, well, we have fraud costs, we have credit losses, we have rewards, we have processing costs, which is all well and good. But the reason that interchange for most retail payment systems, two-sided markets, flows to issuers is because they can affect share. So Chase can give a network more payment volume. And so, and the networks use that to balance participation. People think about it, conceptualize it as funding issuer innovation, rewards, all sorts of things, the neobanks. But imagine a world in which we all had every quote unquote cardholder or consumer or spender had half a dozen or more payment products, cards, credit and debit in their leather wallet or their digital wallet. And imagine that they were completely indifferent over which card they would use. And so choice, the dispositive choice would be the merchant choice. So I go to a restaurant or I go to Walmart and the restaurant or Walmart says, we would prefer to use your Discover debit card. And the restaurant is confident that there's no pushback because I'm really indifferent and there's no loss of sales. Well, in that world, interchange would collapse, and I argue it would be paid to the merchant, notwithstanding cost, because the merchant would be the most important player in terms of what network got the transaction. And it's also, when we look at interchange pricing and look and say, well, geez, the merchants are paying and the issuer, the banks, large banks are taking, or all banks are. There are lots of markets where one side pays more and the other side pays nothing or is subsidized. Search. Well, I use Google, I use Bing, I use Yahoo. Whoever is searching doesn't pay. The advertiser pays. It used to be, and I think it's still probably occasionally the case, you can go to a bar, and the bar will have free drinks for women. No bar has,
Yeah.
but not for men.
Yeah.
No bar has free drinks
They're
for
looking
men
for a better ratio.
versus women.
Yeah.
That doesn't make the market work. Is it fair? Is it unfair? But these. So we look at, if you ask, cardholders love the stuff they get. They take it for granted. And in Canada, the regulators pressured the networks to commit to reducing interchange. It's not for credit, it's not regulated, but it's subject to regulatory pressure. And the networks agreed to make, there've been 2 reductions that they've made, basically hoping that this would forestall any formal regulation. And then the regulator disingenuously put out a press release and said, this is great because we've lowered costs for all these small merchants, and there will be no impact on the rewards that Canadian cardholders love. Well, that's either not true or the banks are volunteering to reduce their profits.
Welcome to the Payments Experts Podcast, a podcast of Global Legal Law Firm. We hope you enjoy this episode. Really excited. We got a remote podcast today. In studio joining us is founding and managing partner of Global Legal Law Firm. That's Christopher Dryden, been doing payments for 20 years. And a very special guest, Eric Grover, joining us remotely. Eric is with Intrepid Adventures is his website. You can find him over at intrepidadventures.net. Eric, it's great to have you on the podcast. Welcome.
Hey Eric, how are you? It's good to meet you, even though it's not face to face, it's sort of face to face. So really happy to have you on. I have to say I've never met Eric. This is the first time I've ever spoken to him. The one thing that I got in advance were some articles that Eric has written for Digital Transactions and some other industry publications. And I will say that based on my reading of Eric's articles, he has far more knowledge than I do when it comes to some serious macro level introspection on the payments industry, and especially a long history to tell you what that looks like. But Eric is what is your role at Intrepid Adventures?
Well, Intrepid Ventures is my business. It's Intrepid is a consultancy, and I advise firms across the payments ecosystem. So payment networks, payment processors, issuers, investors in the space, arms dealers, folks that are selling into the space.
Would that be
private and public?
Similar to like Strawhecker, except you're kind of a one-man show, or?
Yeah, I would say, they're a consultancy, and they're focused principally heavily on the channel, the acquiring side, and really the channel. And I would say I'm not focused on the channel. I cover the whole ecosystem, but are probably more focused on the network. So yes, they provide certainly consulting in the payment space, but I think their focus is a little different.
Okay. And it's interesting because your latest article, and your articles are wide ranging. That's what I really found interesting. I mean, a lot of them have to do, from what I could glean, was kind of a comparison of the risk reward associated with government intervention into private networks and how it's probably not the greatest thing in the world from your opinion. But recently you wrote an article about the CFPB and it narrowing its focus in the wake of layoffs. Why don't we just start there and give
Sure.
give us your thoughts on what's going on the federal level, especially with the new administration?
Yeah, so this is a sea change, and so the CFPB was established by Dodd-Frank, and by design, it was intended to be remote from Congress. It was designed to be self-funded by the Fed, and it was given very broad powers, authority. So consolidating regulation of consumer finance, financial services in one entity. And it was initially staffed by some folks that were quite partisan, had a strong distrust of industry, and had what I would describe as a paternalistic view toward consumers, meaning that their view was that consumers, even given full disclosure of all the material facts around various financial products, would make the wrong decision, and a beneficent regulator was needed to guide them. During the first Trump term, under Mulvaney, acting director Mulvaney, and under Director Kathy Cloninger, there was a pullback, but the CFPB remained. Under
Well, they challenged the funding and whether or
challenged
not
the funding,
yeah.
and challenged the funding, and the Supreme Court upheld. And I frankly, I was surprised, but I read it and I understand the rationale. But the Supreme Court basically held Congress has the authority to set up whatever funding mechanism it wanted, and that Congress, by authorizing self-appropriation from the Fed, that was power of the purse by Congress. So that has been held to be constitutional. The court also held that the director could be removed, the CFPB director, without cause, which was a change, and which is one of the reasons that Chopra left almost not immediately, but was going to leave upon Trump coming in. Currently, the incoming administration has dramatically reined in the CFPB, has fired 90%-ish of all the staff.
Well, I don't know if you saw this morning, the reason I wanted to lead off with this is because I saw a headline this morning that a federal judge actually put a stop to all the layoffs. And I don't know if it's temporary. I mean, it looks like the courts, it's they don't really want to put up much of a challenge to some of the administration's moves that are going on right now. But they did halt it at least this morning. I don't know where it's going.
I don't know where it's going either. But what I would say with confidence is this administration clearly, the administration cannot get rid of the CFPB. So there have been folks who said, waved their arms and said the administration is lawlessly going to eliminate the CFPB. They can't do that.
They can sure as heck neuter it, though.
Well, yes, they can absolutely. They can make it. They can reduce its bandwidth considerably.
Yeah.
And they're going to do that. But absent Congress eliminating the CFPB by statute, the next a Gavin Newsom administration or a J.B. Pritzker administration or the next administration could revive and restaff. I mean, because the CFPB was created by Congress and as an administrative agency, and there are different views about the power the president can can exercise over it. But it is an administrative agency, notwithstanding being constructed with this funding mechanism from the Fed, and Congress, if there is a desire to do so, can change it, can change its mission.
Well, yeah, I was going to say. Well, I mean, I agree. I agree with you wholeheartedly. I look at the American public, and I probably shouldn't say this on a live podcast, but I'm not necessarily always impressed with the engagement or knowledge base of people surrounding the things that take place in their life. Literally, like I hear younger people that I'm around ask me questions about taxes and the lack of knowledge. These are educated people. It's really kind of startling sometimes. But I do believe that there is a mission for the CFPB. Now, I also agree with you that the initial approach and this paternalistic nature to it, I mean, obviously, Trump wants to sell Trump steaks again. So, he's got to remove all barriers about doing that. But, Trump University could revive itself at any moment. But I do believe that there is that for a lot of people, and I usually focus my attention on. I had a really good relationship with my grandparents and a lot of my family in that generation, and it's like the greatest generation. They went through the Depression, they went through World War II, they live through a lot of the heartache that we've never experienced. We'll probably never come close to experiencing. But in that level of people, I'm a Cold War kid. The amount of change, and you look a little older than me, the amount of change in technology and the amount of change in the world in our lifetime is probably overwhelming to certain people. And there's so much sensory through devices. It's not just the television any longer, which you can control a lot of. But the devices, I do believe that technology could be overwhelming to some people that might not have a background on. And so I do believe that there are things I hear these horrible stories about older people having, getting bilked over like telesale schemes, or hit this button because the IRS is on you, right? Remember those? I do think there's a purpose.
But this is, so the tools, there's no question that there are horrible stories of people being defrauded. And there are bad actors out there. There always have been, and there always will be. They now have more tools to get to people. Arguably, there are also more tools to protect people. And I think, there is clearly an important role for regulators, long has been, to identify and prosecute fraudsters and prosecute them vigorously. And I would be of the view, figuratively, hang them high. You get bad actors, and go after them and get them. But I don't think that's controversial. Sometimes people pay lip service, but the notion that government, the state, should protect consumers and businesses from genuine fraud from malevolent actors, that's real. I think it's non-controversial. You can argue about what's the best means. And before the CFPB existed, the existing agencies had, broad authority to regulate and prosecute fraud. It was, spread
FTC,
over
there's watchdogs.
And I think, we can argue that whether it's vigorous enough, but I think that element of the role, whether it's performed by the CFPB, the FTC, Fed, is not terribly controversial, and it's important, and it's very important. But the elements of the CFPB that are controversial are, the policy making by the regulator, which I would argue is Congress has the prerogative to make policy, not the regulator. The regulator is the cop.
No, I get it. Like I don't like the rulemaking process of CFPB either.
We definitely need a vigorous night watchman in the regulator seat, but we don't want a political actor. And under Rohit Chopra, the CFPB was a very, very political agency.
Oh, I agree with you. I couldn't agree. But it's funny because we've been talking. I've been doing a lot more podcasts this year, and it's been an interesting time to talk about certain things. And I like your articles because I like to think in a bigger picture. And a lot of times I'm in microcosms in what I do for my job. And so, at least in the payments world. But one of the things that I find interesting about where we're starting this conversation is that I too agree that there's a purpose. But when the overreaction to the partisanship at the inception of this or formation of this agency being a watchdog, and you start stripping down the federal apparatus to a shell, which it's happening, right? And whether you agree with it or you don't agree with it, it doesn't really matter to me. I think the machine's in place to start to do this. And what I've said is that I've had this conversation going around my house with the kids a lot the last month about when you do something, you need to pay attention to what you're communicating because a lot of time there's unintended consequences to your communication. And I think one of the unintended consequences to what's taking place right now is that you're going to get states who I think know far less about some of this subject matter. And you've got people who know far less about this subject matter wading into the regulatory watchdog space in a way that's not always well refined, that is going to produce a boatload of inconsistent or unintended consequences because they're not going to act uniformly. Now I've got potentially 50 different regulatory frameworks to deal with versus one. And I think that this is coming. I don't know how fast that wave's going to come, but I always point to the Illinois case on credit on surcharge, right? Like,
Yeah,
go ahead.
well, Chris, we're seeing it already, and we're seeing it. And what first jumps to mind is in terms of what we were talking about earlier, interchange price regulation. State of Illinois, was it June or July, passed the Interchange Fee Prohibition Act. And this is the first state level. There have been attempts in a number of states over the years. This is the first one to pass, and it bans interchange fees from being assessed on sales tax and tips.
Yep.
And that takes effect this coming July. And there's a backstop that the industry has to support manual refunds, which is practically what's going to happen because the industry is simply incapable of responding, with automated systems by that date.
Look, I'm not a technical person. Conceptually, I understand technology as it relates to what we do. But when you get down to it, I was thinking that it would be a Herculean task to carve out one state's consumers and merchants related to this to reprogram a system that's been in place for a really long time to operate not the way it was intended to operate. Now, I don't know if it would be, but my thinking is that would be a Herculean task. I don't know what time frame they could do it in.
So there's no question it will be, and it will be because the data that you need to comply with it isn't captured and isn't passed up today. And of all the payment card networks, only a few of them, for some transactions, capture sales tax data, and then only for B2B transactions. But the data isn't captured. The assessment of interchange fees is different. So it's enormously. Point of sale providers will have to make system changes. Merchant acquirers and processors will have to make system changes. ISVs will have to make system changes. All the payment networks will have to make system changes. Issuers, all of them, and there are over 9,500 issuers in the United States. The bill, as I read it, would cover issuers worldwide. Now, enforcement's another matter, but if a China UnionPay card user or a JCB card user who's at O'Hare Airport, that transaction would be covered, and the acquirer that was captured that would have to respond. And if the merchant submitted a manual request for a refund, they would have to get it. But that's Illinois. Colorado has a bill, Fair Swipe Fee Act and Consumer Security or Protection Act, which does something very similar but slightly different. So it also would ban interchange fees on sales tax and tips. It would ban default interchange for all politically unsympathetic issuers with over 50 billion in assets, which is there are about 50 of them. Covers most transactions. It wouldn't do that for the 9,500 or so small guys. It would impose, imitating the European structure, it would impose caps of 30 basis points on interchange for credit and 20 basis points for credit on debit for charitable contributions. So it's a whole kind of a cocktail of different stuff. Again, enormously expensive to comply with.
I was going to say, at what point do you think the card brands and the networks push back and just like, look, this is impossible for us. Like, you guys have no replacement, or it would drive up the expense associated with accommodating this legislation, and that where items weren't capped, the other area would just become extremely expensive. I mean, you're just talking about rewards maybe going away. I'm talking about like the actual cost to use the credit systems becoming.
Boy, the whole system. This cost will be big again. So this is, I did a back of the napkin estimate on just compliance, trying just to provide automated compliance for the Illinois Interchange Fee Prohibition Act. And many, many billions of dollars. And I thought it would take at least 4 to 5 years, at least, to in an automated fashion comply. But there will always be a long tail anyway of manual merchants that aren't complying and are sending in emails, faxes, FedEx. So this reintroduces a manual set of operations that we really haven't seen in the 1970s. And if you imagine, let's say that all 50 states have their own flavor of this.
Yeah.
The cost on the system, and the system, merchant acquirers, processors, ISVs, ISOs, point of sale system providers, networks, and some of them traditional, but also non-traditional network, alternative payment systems, and issuers, enormous. And no one breaks the system, but the cost of this stuff gets baked in, and ultimately, I would argue everybody suffers. And instead of trying to make the system better, innovating, trying to make it safer, the payment system ends up spending lots of money complying with this onerous patchwork. And an onerous patchwork that once it's established, every one of these state legislatures is going to be adding, its wishes of the year, whatever is in vogue for the next, ratchet or the next cut.
Yeah, I mean, the dangerous side to this is, I kind of look at it in relation to employment law. California is a heavily regulated state. And what I learned is we started to represent businesses, because we represent businesses in every capacity. Like, we're payments lawyers, but we are a business. So we have employees, we're very aware. And, the Fair Labor Standards Act sets a floor. But then you get a place like California, Illinois, there's certain states where they're very pro-worker. And so the employee rights are far in advance of that floor at the FLSA. And the longer that you let somebody like Colorado come up with this cocktail of a whole bunch of restrictions on the payment system, what kind of floor can you come in? Because I personally think the cascading effect is deregulation to state regulation, back to Fed regulation, so that we've got one standardization of a set of rules and we're not all over the place, right? But then that's you're only preempted to a certain respect. At a certain point in time, a state can choose to have greater regulation than what the federal level is. And the longer you let the states kind of come in and decide what they're going to do, you run the risk that the federal legislation that comes behind it, if it comes, would in essence be fairly restrictive too. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there's a real federalism real federalism issue here about if the payment system, and there are state level regulations, and particularly like money transfer business, not every state has its own licensing requirement.
Yeah, I mean, that's a cluster, right? I mean, that's the thing that I go to, and where people are trying to make profit in the payments system, at least from our clients, is finding nooks and crannies in there, but you skirt the line of being a money transmitter a lot of times. And, everybody throws around the word PayFac, but there's like only 6 pages of registered PayFacs, so like, and just because they've got the ability to do stuff doesn't mean you've got the ability to do stuff. So it's not the easiest thing to comply with.
No, and if I'm a bank and I can, we have federal preemption, then I get around that. And we have, just over 4,000 commercial banks still, and close to 5,000 credit unions. So there are a lot out there still, but it doesn't serve consumers, doesn't serve the businesses using the payment system. To have an overly complex and burdensome regulatory patchwork. It does serve incumbents in some respects, right? Because the entry cost of getting in is high, and existing systems have the resources to be licensed and to comply. This is a cynical view, but if I'm a PayPal, I have the resources to comply in every state. If I'm a Western Union, I have the resources to do that, and I'm already doing it. And I'm a new fintech, and I've come up and I've got what I think is, I've got a putatively better mousetrap. But now I've got this burden. I've got to go out and undertake this Herculean effort to comply across the country. And the risk of failure is that much higher, the cost of getting in.
I'm watching people buy their way in these days. Like, it's interesting. So this is another thing I wanted to lob up to you because it came out. And I heard about it yesterday. In fact, on our podcast yesterday with a gentleman named Alan Kopelman, who's been in the industry for a long time. He said, "Hey, did you hear about?" And I don't know if it was on the air, but he said, "Hey, did you hear about the merger?" And I'm like, "What happened?" He said, "Global bought WorldPay." And then I saw the actual, the alert come out this morning on it, and more consolidation in our industry. And one of the things that I've seen is that as there's been further consolidation, some of the relationships that used to be out there, like retail registered ISO with Fiserv, you have to buy your way into that these days. They're not just giving them away anymore. And so what you're kind of describing to me sounds very similar to what I'm seeing in our little neck of the woods is some of these relationships that have traditionally been there, you can't even establish those from the ground up any longer. You've got to actually go find somebody who's willing to offload that to you.
Well, and that development it's fascinating because, as you said, it is creating that transaction or set of transactions will create increased concentration in merchant acquiring and processing because global gets bigger. FIS is picking up the old Total Systems issuer processing business.
Mm-hmm.
So their issuer processing business gets bigger. And both of those, issuer processing in the US and in Europe is kind of an oligopoly. Merchant acquiring, certainly the large guys have a huge share, but there's still a lot of players. But I think there's an interesting observation I would make. Back 2019, 2020, there were a series of M&A transactions that had analysts in the industry saying that colossi fintech payments processors were the future. So we had Fiserv acquiring First Data. We had
WorldPay acquiring Vantiv. Yeah.
WorldPay. We had Global Payments acquiring TSYS. We had Worldline acquiring Genico. And then we had Nexi, which rolled up a couple large merchant processors in Europe. And the idea was that these five had such scale and such a breadth of processing assets, and in the case of FIS and Fiserv and Worldline and Nexi, also payment network assets, that created something that was almost unstoppable. This is where the industry is going. Now, it hasn't really panned out because now we've seen that FIS has reversed course in terms of the breadth. So they've gotten out of the merchant acquiring business. Global Payments, they sold off NetSpend, their prepay business, which was an awkward fit anyway. Now they've sold off the issuer processing asset, which at the time they contended there were going to be compelling synergies participating on both sides of the network, as did FIS, as did Fiserv. And of course, Worldline retreated from the point of sale terminal business. So I think it's an interesting reversal of what a lot of folks publicly declared was the future.
I think part of it's scale too, right? I mean, bigger isn't always better. I mean, we're in a very ever-changing landscape, and I think being nimble is a benefit. And I think the larger you get, and some of these acquisitions too, culturally, like I go back to this one, but when Vantiv acquired Mercury, I thought that was a great acquisition. But then culturally, the organizations were so different. They never were able to consolidate the organizations, and they distinctly left them standalone. And I always found that very interesting. And I asked somebody in the Mercury legal department, like, hey, why aren't you guys really working with Vantiv? And why are you guys still separate? And they said, you know what? Our companies just culturally are so different. They got to the point where they thought it was better that we just remain on our own, even though we're trying to cross-pollinate as much as possible where there's synergies associated with us because we make sense in a lot of regards operationally, but there's just certain things that it's just not a connection.
Well, I think that was an instance where they acquired Mercury because They wanted the model that it had developed. Part and parcel of that was the culture that was necessary to develop it, but that culture didn't fit. And we see that a lot. And I think with all of these mega payment processing / fintech mergers, there have been some management diseconomies of scale and complexity.
Oh, Fiserv, the Fiserv First Data thing's huge to me. I will tell you that Fiserv, when they came in, didn't know what they had, started to look at the inefficiencies of First Data, have started to shore up holes, and they have been, I don't mean to speak ill, but they've been ruthless about how they've worked with people, and it's just more, it's a take it or leave it. They're like, look, this is how it's going to be. We don't really care. We understand that this may have been a mistake. You're going to have to pay for it. Doesn't really matter. Like they've come in, and as far as there being an idea of having an ISO channel, I'm not really sure that's going to be on a go forward with them.
Yeah, they are. I mean, that's an industrial strength processor. I'm not sure anyone would have in recent history declared it as a super client friendly, flexible, innovative entity. Certainly, but scale processor, if you want to do anything at scale, good place to go. If you want speed, innovation, a high touch, I'm not sure that's where I would go.
No, I agree with you. I just know from a partner-centric perspective, right? Because, they inherited a ton of partners. It almost feels like they either don't want them, or the term dictation that's going to happen about what it's going to be like to work with them, they're setting the bar really quickly. And it hasn't been very friendly.
Yeah, that's, they're, the economics are shared across the channel. And I think if I'm the Goliath processor, and if I could push a button and control everything and to capture all the economics, many of them would do just that. But the choice historically has not been that. The choice has been, if I don't work with, partner with, support this channel partner, ISO, ISV, somebody else will. So my choice is, do I get a piece of it and help, or do I get none of it? And that's healthy, I think, because we get competition to serve folks that are adding value in the channel. If those folks don't have choice, well, then the scenario you're describing, or if that choice is reduced, the scenario you're describing starts to become much more real, much more of a problem.
Do you think that'll push innovation? Because one of the things I read that I liked in one of your articles was really talking about the attempts of innovation outside the traditional, dating back to I can't even remember the name of the company, but I didn't realize that DigiCurrency came out in '89, and there was some sort of player up until '98. And then you kind of went through a little bit. I like always looking at a historical and seeing where we were, what worked, what didn't work, and one of your articles kind of did that. It talked about potentially the Fed buying up a bunch of Bitcoin, but that might artificially inflate the value of Bitcoin, which wouldn't be beneficial necessarily. But then it also went back to stablecoin, which is 1-to-1, which I think is the next iteration of digital currency that's going to take hold. Primarily, I may have a cynical view. It's just because the banks are going to be involved, and so that they're going to figure out how their value is involved in it. Trying to cut out the banks is something that Bitcoin just I don't see how you get around the barrier of the bank obstruction to that in the marketplace. But stablecoin makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, where do you think the innovation is going to come? As there's less sale options out there for the ISO? Because I do believe some of the stuff you touch on is fascinating. I just think it's still so much in its infancy. Who knows where it's going to go?
I think stablecoins. So we think about. DigiCash was in some respects the first digital currency, and it failed, but it was early. We got Bitcoin, the first distributed digital ledger, crypto, the mother of all cryptocurrencies. there are like 25,000 cryptocurrencies that have been launched, about half of which have failed. I would argue in almost every case, however, they have yet, while some are interesting speculative instruments, there have yet to been compelling mainstream use cases. And certainly in the more mature markets, North America, Europe, the existing digital systems work pretty well. So it's hard to see where they would play a role. Having said that, stablecoins address one of the big problems as a payment system the crypto has had of volatility of the underlying asset that's being used to make payments. They also, in theory, address some of the regulatory concerns that if the stablecoin is issued by a regulated entity, there's transparency, there should be greater comfort with those. They still have the issue of where is the compelling use case or use cases. I think that we may see interesting use cases for cross-border payments. I think outside the U.S., dollar-backed stablecoins in markets with weak existing payment systems could be quite compelling. If you're a consumer or a business and you can have dollar stablecoins issued by Tether, by Circle, by Citibank, and you're in Venezuela, and you can deal in dollars, or you're in Zimbabwe, you can pay and hold payments in dollars.
I've seen problems. It's interesting. We've got a guy that we've represented, and he was buying USDC, and he was selling it internationally, and he just had like hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of chargebacks related to his sale of USDC to Italian cardholders. Right. Went through the entire chargeback process, had all of the supporting documentation, had purchased the USDC, had circulated it, and he lost universally. And it doesn't sound like this isn't a payment system use case. It sounds like it's more of he's buying the. I mean, what was the agreed? Agreed. But I still think that there's a lot of skepticism associated with that actually being something that's fungible, right? I mean, to me, just the fact of what he was doing, he was finding a place in the market where, based on exchange rates, he could sell something, make a little bit of a cushion on arbitrage. And when it came, I thought it was very innovative. Sorry. No worries. I thought it was very innovative what he was doing, and yet when it came down to it, the card issuers, there was no defense for him whatsoever. So I agree with you. I think that there needs to be use cases that would make things supported. On a total aside. I'm a big fan of Michael Lewis. I just read Going Infinite. And I have to say I learned a lot about cryptocurrency just from reading about FTX and Sam Bankman-Fried and kind of like what the crypto markets look like. And, from his time at Jane Street doing jump trading. And like, it was pretty fascinating. I mean, it was a world that I can't say that I've stepped too much in, past the shallow end of the pool. I thought that he does a very good job of taking very complex subject matter and delivering it in a way that's easily digestible. And it was for me, and I thought it was really fascinating. The interesting thing about Sam was that his approach, regardless of how it ended up, was to come to America to regulate FTX.
Yeah.
And, his whole approach was, look, all these other guys are shady. I want to be the landmark. I want to be, the flagship of this is how we're supposed to do it and kind of get this introduced.
Chris, I'm reminded of Ralph Waldo Emerson's quip that the louder he spoke of his honor, the faster we counted our spoons.
Yeah, no kidding.
And we had, FTX and open kimono and want to be regulated. We had the lads at Wirecard. We had
the German company.
The German company and Angela Merkel. Angela Merkel was publicly advocating on the behalf, and the German regulator was tried to get the British regulators to clamp down on the hedge funds that said it was a problem. We had Mozito and Michael Lewis. We had M. Powell. and all, there is a dollop of skepticism, but which is, and those are the exceptions, clearly. It is, and they're always going to be, the system is somewhat open to newcomers, which I think it should be, and that's good for us all. There are going to be problem actors that get in, and the idea is that they get caught. We have transparency.
So from a macro perspective, I'm interested to ask you this. From the world that we play in, which is everybody below the member banks and the larger payment processors, or even the super ISOs to a certain degree, we represent a lot of FSPs. But what do you think is something that may be just coming onto the horizon, that might not be something that is in full view yet, that the people that we assist, or merchants, I think merchants is another good category, that we haven't spoke of today, that might be something that's coming into their world that they're just not aware of?
Boy, that's a hard one, because I think our market is mature, it's competitive, it's reasonably well served. The existing systems are habit. I think in the channel, small ISOs are going to have to struggle for relevancy. I mean, you got to say, what value do I bring versus, the ISV as a channel, has the wind at its back. Whatever there are different models, but the idea of embedding payments in a broader offer, stickier offer, that's quite compelling. There'll be struggle over the economics. How much economics do the ISVs get? How much economics does the back end processor and the bank get?
I think it depends on the sharing of the SaaS fees too. Like if you got people out there independently selling, it depends on what they get to share in. But that's what Alan was saying on our podcast yesterday, is like, if you're not selling software, you better figure that out really quick, or you're not going to be here very long. You got
to have something. You can't, if it's just a pure sales model, there's a long tail, but that is not a place to be. I mean, if you don't have something else, some hook, it doesn't have to be your own software you're selling. It can be white labeled, but it's got to be something that's bundled around your payments. Otherwise, the attrition rates, the fee erosion, are just not sustainable.
All right.
It is. I think, I fear that, and this is not so relevant for, a U.S. domestic ISO, but at the macro level, with our budding global tariff war, payments protectionism, which has been a real festering issue for decades, but has been the exception, which is to say that there are countries that have resisted U.S. payment systems, payment networks, payment processors participating in their domestic markets, and have favored national champions. We've seen those, China, Russia, but most countries in the free world, most countries in the non-free world or semi-free world, it hasn't been an issue using American payment systems, letting American payment processors operate or acquire national players. And I think in a world where we're lobbying tariffs right and left, that payment protectionism is going to get much worse, which is ultimately bad for everybody. I think and this is, it's not new, but it's going to get worse.
You think it'll disconnect the marketplaces more?
It'll increase the burden of transactions, and therefore increase the burden of commerce, and increase the cost of goods and services. A world where we have we're talking about a patchwork of regulations within the U.S. states. In a world in which blocks of countries or individual countries all have to have their own payment systems and don't want to rely on any other country's payment systems, it's a lot making payments it becomes more difficult.
Though I've dipped my toe into this one too, and what I find very interesting is that in a lot of other jurisdictions, the central bank just controls everything. So your entryway is through the central bank, and they limit. And I don't know how much they necessarily understand. I know Asia and the Middle East is very much like this, but if you don't know somebody at the central bank level or in government, you're never getting in. And so I think the ability to like enter into those marketplaces is much more difficult.
Well, it's getting, in some markets it's been very difficult. It's very political. But many markets entry barriers have been pretty low for foreign actors. And India is kind of an interesting case because it's mixed. The regulators understand the value of competition. They understand the value of American payment processors and networks competing in India, but they don't want them to be too successful. There's a notion that they prefer some national players to be dominant or to be the major players. But the market has been open, albeit with requirements for in-country processing. Contrast that with China, which is the second largest electronic payments market in the world, the largest e-commerce payments market in the world. In 2001, as part of its accession to the WTO, China made a commitment to 100% open up its domestic payments market by 2006. As of 2006, there was not a single Visa, MasterCard, PayPal, Amex, Discover, or JCB transaction in China. We're now in 2025, and at the time in 2001, China UnionPay, didn't exist, Alipay didn't exist, WeChat Pay didn't exist. We're in 2025. MasterCard has a domestic processing subsidiary in China. It's a joint venture with a subsidiary of the central bank. They've done a handful of transactions, but effectively, U.S. companies and actually non-Chinese companies simply haven't been able to compete. So much more severe. Europe has been a different animal. In Europe, specifically the European Union, the dominant pan-European retail payment systems are MasterCard and Visa. The dominant wallets are Google Pay, Apple Pay, PayPal. There have been and continue to be national payment systems in many markets. So, for example, in France, the largest card network is Carte Bancaire, but Visa and MasterCard are the largest pan-European systems. The European regulators, the European Commission in Brussels, the ECB in Frankfurt, don't particularly care for that, but they have been, to date, unlike the Chinese government, not willing to do more than encourage banks to participate in more European systems. And I think we're going to see a change there. There's going to be more. They've been talked about. They want payment strategic autonomy, or strategic autonomy in payments, and we may see more aggressive action from European regulators, which I think ultimately will harm Europeans, but it's certainly going to harm some U.S. payment systems and wallet players. Central banks as players in many markets are the primary regulator. In many markets, but not all, but many markets, the central bank also competes. Brazil is a very vivid example of that. The central bank is the primary financial system regulator. The central bank launched a payment system called PIX, which is now the biggest P2P and payment system in Brazil. It's a major retail payment system, major B2B payment system. 6 months before the central bank launched that system, they told Facebook that it had to. They took Facebook's WhatsApp Pay, which was a PayPal-like wallet, out of the market, and they said they were worried about financial system stability. Then they waited until they mandated that all major payment service providers support the central bank system, which got them around the problem of you're building a new payment system. You don't have any relevance until you have a critical mass of entities that are willing to use it on both sides. But if you mandate, if you can tell people you have to use it, you have to support it, you get around that. So, there's a case of this: the central bank is the regulator, the central bank is a competitor, but then still there are a bunch of private sector actors, both domestic and foreign, in that market. So it's kind of a hybrid.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, look, I want to tell you this has been a fascinating discussion. I really appreciated your articles. If people want to get a hold of you, how would they go about doing so? And what is it that you think that you could offer some of our listenership?
So easiest way to contact me would be at eric.grover@intrepidventures.com. That's eric.grover@intrepidventures.com. And I bring a comprehensive understanding of the payment system competitive landscape and dynamics. And I maybe sounded a little gloomy during some of my remarks.
Oh no, you were great, man. Are you kidding me? I really appreciate a stark perspective on what's going on. I think people look. Knowledge is king. Knowledge is power. The more people know, the more information that people can truly gather to make critical choices, do critical thinking, and then come up and make some good choices based on that. I'm pro that all day, and so I love hearing things that are first impression, and that maybe I need to ask a follow-up question because I don't necessarily understand. So that's great.
No, I mean the industry is much more open, much more innovative. I've been in this industry a long time.
Yeah. No, I know. It's very obvious.
When I started, it was, it was slow moving. I would suggest that it wasn't, massively innovative. There weren't a lot of new entrants. And the barriers to entry have come down in most parts of the payments industry. Almost every sector is more competitive than it was, 30, 40 years ago. And that's good. That's a good thing, I think. And I hope that it continues to get more competitive, more innovative. I worry.
Well, we'll see. But look, make me this promise. As you see things in the marketplace, reach out. Because, look, I would love to have you back on. Really appreciate your time and coming on and sharing your perspective and your knowledge. It's been wonderful to have you on. It's Eric Grover. And when you find something that you think is worthwhile, we're always willing to, even if it's 20 minutes, man, you just let us know.
Super.
All right.
All right, sir.
Thank you, Eric. Have a great weekend.
Absolutely. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Payments Experts Podcast, a podcast of Global Legal Law Firm. Visit us online today at globallegallawfirm.com.